Okay, good afternoon and welcome to Eastern Washington University Biology Department Darwin Day celebration. We're so pleased that you joined us today. We've been celebrating Darwin Day in this similar fashion for over 10 years now in the department, where we have a great speaker followed by a Darwin or evolutionary themed cake competition. So today our speaker is Dr. Jim Costa, and I will introduce him in just a little bit, but we have a few other activities planned first. And even before I dive into that, in case you aren't familiar with Eastern Washington University, we are a regional comprehensive university located in Cheney, Washington. You can follow us on social media at EWU Biology. You can write to this email here if you would like to be on the list for our seminar series, and you can check out our website. So we offer a number of different degree tracks, and we have a Master's of Science in Biology as well. My name is Jessica Allen, and I'm on the faculty in the department. So today we are going to mix it up a little bit. We'll start with a bit of Darwin and Wallace trivia. And then Dr. Costa will will take it away and talk to us about the Darwins and their experiments. And then we'll have a Q&A session with Dr. Costa. And then finally, we have a number of evolution and Darwin themed cakes to take a look at. And if you want to stay on for that part, everybody will get to weigh in on a poll to vote for their favorite Darwin cake. Okay, so first the trivia. I have 6 trivia questions for you today. So you can get a pencil and a piece of paper out if you want, so you can keep track. I encourage you to not Google the answers. This sort of defeats the purpose of the fun here, but we'll see how well you can do. Okay, so here we go. Our first question is, how old was Darwin when he embarked on his famous Beagle voyage? How old do you think he was? Now, this picture of him wasn't taken at the time that he embarked on his voyage. It was later in his life, so that is a bit of a hint. How old do you think he was when he went out on his voyage? Okay, question number 2. In what year was Darwin knighted? What year was he knighted? Again, I have a picture in here. This might not necessarily coincide with that year, but you can think about what this answer might be. And in case you're wondering, I will go over the questions one more time before I give you the answers. So if I'm going too fast, don't worry about it. Okay, next question. Question 3. In Darwin's most famous works on the origin of species, how many times does he use the word evolution or its cognates? So evolution, evolve, evolving, evolved. How many times do you think he actually used that word in On the Origin of Species? Okay. Next, I have a true or false question for you. So is the following statement true or false? Darwin, Australia was named after Charles Darwin because he traveled there on his journey with the Beagle, and he was on board the ship when the town was named. So is this true or is this false? Was Darwin there for the naming of Darwin? Okay, now we can't talk about Darwin without at least mentioning Alfred Russel Wallace. So we do have a couple of Alfred Russel Wallace questions for you today as well. Okay. In a single trip to the United States, Alfred Russel Wallace traveled to Washington, D.C. to give a series of lectures on evolution. He then traversed the entire country and went to San Francisco, where he gave a series of lectures on what topic? So, what topic did Wallace give a series of lectures on in San Francisco? And I have one last Alfred Russel Wallace question for you today. And it's another true or false. Okay, is this statement true or false? Alfred Russel Wallace was never a rich man. One time he was so hard up for money that he accepted a bet from the Flat Earth Society to prove that the world was round. Is this true or is this false? True or false? Okay, so here's this list of 6 questions that I just breezed on through. Take a look at any of them that you need to think about one more time. Check out those true and false statements. Okay. Finalize your answers. And now I'll go over them. Okay. First, how old was Darwin when he embarked on his adventure? 22 years old. So imagine you finish up your undergraduate degree and you get on a ship for a number of years sailing all over the world. That's a pretty great adventure. 2, so how many times does the word evolution or its cognates appear in On the Origin of Species? The answer is only once. The word evolve is actually the last word in the entire book. The third question was a trick question. Darwin was not knighted. However, 3 of his sons were. So probably threw you for a loop on that one. Okay, the 4th question was false. So Darwin, Australia is named after Charles Darwin, but it was named during the following trip that the Beagle took around the world, on which Darwin was not a passenger, but the crew did name Darwin, Australia after him. The answer to the 5th question was spiritualism. So Wallace gave a series of lectures in San Francisco on spiritualism. He was very interested in spirituality, and he even attended seances. And then 6th, finally, this one was true. The Flat Earth Society did offer Wallace a bet here. Wallace did demonstrate that the world is round. However, the Flat Earth Society never paid up on their bet. So there you have it, a little bit of Darwin and Wallace trivia to get us going for the day. And our speaker today, again, right just before I really dive into introducing him, in one of his roles, he's the executive director of Highlands Biological Station, and I wanted to make a little bit of a pitch for the station. So this is an incredible field station located in one of North America's biodiversity hotspots in the Southern Appalachians. And they offer an incredible wealth of field courses in the summer. They have a semester-long field course for undergraduate students in the fall semester. They also have a lot of internships and they have grants in native research. It's a great place, so I really encourage you to check it out. Okay, and so with that, it is such a pleasure to introduce Jim Costa today. We're so grateful to have him here for this event. He's an incredibly accomplished scholar and scientist and educator. He earned his PhD from the University of Georgia and conducted his postdoctoral research at Harvard University. He's been a professor at Western Carolina University for many years now and the executive director of Highlands Biological Station. He's the author of 5 books. One is a book on entomology, and then the other 4 are on Darwin and Wallace and the theory of evolution. So a great speaker for our Darwin Day celebration. He's also been awarded a number of prestigious international fellowships, and he's also trustees of the Charles Darwin trust. So with that, Jim, I will pass it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jesse. Really appreciate you and Justin and your colleagues for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. And I thought that since we're celebrating Darwin's birthday, I would try to masquerade as Darwin today. I can do pretty well, sort of imitating Darwin on top, but I need to work on my beard. So this is about the best I can do today. But since it's going to be hard to actually give a talk while I'm masquerading as Darwin, I will hold off on that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you see that? Hopefully that's visible. I want to say
looks great.
Welcome and thank you to the participants. I really appreciate your interest in this subject, near and dear to my heart. This is a project that I've been keen on for some years, and I wanted to kind of share with you some perspectives on, Darwin as an experimentalist and what we can learn from that, but in so doing, maybe shed a little light on Darwin, the person, and that's an important part of my interest in this project. I'd worked on Darwin in various ways, written about him for some time, and had gotten to appreciate that he's a very interesting individual, the human being, and I wanted to maybe help people, my students and others, get beyond the cardboard cutout sort of Darwin, the icon, and more a sense of the person and his creativity, and maybe what we can learn from that today. So that was sort of the genesis of my book, Darwin's Backyard. And much of what I'll be talking about today will kind of draw upon Darwin's backyard, including Darwin-inspired experiments and observational studies that we can do ourselves. We can do in our own backyards or in schools or at home inside. And in that Darwinian spirit, Darwin-inspired learning, we can emulate his methodology and gain quite a lot from that. So I mentioned Darwin as a kind of iconic figure, and I had realized that, if you think about all of the portraits, the photographs that have come down to us, they are typically Victorian in depicting what seems to be a terribly serious guy, maybe even a bit melancholy in some of the images. You certainly don't get a sense, I think, of a completely different side to this individual, and that is, that this was an individual with a great sense of humor, kind of an impish sense of humor, someone who could readily kind of poke fun at himself, reveled in practical jokes at times, just a very interesting individual, also a friend, a father, a husband. All of these are part of Darwin the person that you certainly would not get a sense of that if you were, you just knew of this individual from some readings and these kinds of images that have come down to us. But they really reflect Victorian portraiture more than the individual himself. So I want to give you an introduction to a very different side of Darwin, the kind of impish and creative Darwin the family man, Darwin the friend, the husband, the dad. And I titled this presentation Experimentising with the Darwins, plural, purposely, because really, as you'll see, I think his experiments were often very much a family affair. It was, everybody kind of taking part in Darwin's experiments. It was the kids, it was Emma, his wife, it was family friends, it was distant relatives, sometimes far-flung correspondents. So I'll give you a sense of his love of what he liked to call fool's experiments. So think about Darwin the guy, Darwin the person. He's very much a family-loving man, right? He marries Emma Wedgwood in 1839. They moved just south of London to the small village of Down. Over the some years, they have 10 children, only 7 of whom actually survived to adulthood. So there was some tragedy that they suffered as well. But he had a pretty kind of boisterous and lively house with the kids, kind of all running around. And as they're growing up, these kids and Emma herself, as well as their family friends and others, are all kind of pitching in and playing a role in some of Darwin's experiments. You get a sense of Darwin personality-wise from some of the accounts that have come down to us. For example, Leonard Darwin kind of reminiscing about one of their years-long projects, which was this mystery, what they called the mystery of the buzzing places, these curious spots in the garden where bumblebees would alight and then sort of buzz away and then fly off, and then they would land at another spot and they would buzz and fly off. And there were some times when all of the kids were just racing around frenetically in the garden, chasing bumblebees, trying to figure out, what are they doing? What are these bees doing? And Leonard Darwin later reminisced that he remembered his father as just like a boy amongst other boys, just out there running around, trying to chase down the bees and figure out where they're going and where they're coming from. And, they never did quite figure this out. It's called trap lining today, where the male bees are kind of pheromonally marking spots and as they're trying to attract mates. But they had no idea about that. But it kind of, the fact that they were just trying to figure this out and doing it together, it kind of sheds some light on, the dynamic there in the family. You get a sense of Darwin as a proud dad when, for example, he fires off this little note to an entomology magazine, the Weekly Intelligencer, and he's reporting on the capture of 3 rather rare beetles in town. And he signs this Francis, Leonard, and Horace Darwin. Right? They were 11, 9, and 8 years old at the time. I mean, you very much get a sense of the proud dad, that here are his kids, out there collecting these beetles. He certainly had a passion for beetles himself. Seeing a little publication like this, which he wrote a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it says something about his fondness for the kids and how they're all kind of in it together, exploring the natural world. And I really love that. I love that about Darwin. And I got to realizing that there's an awful lot to Darwin's experiments that we could learn from today. So many of these experiments and similar sorts of studies are really pretty fun. They're kind of quirky. Some of them are really odd. There's always an interesting scientific question behind them, but they're pretty fun. And so an interesting device to kind of hook the interest of our students, our young students especially. They're very accessible, a lot of his experiments, as I'll show you. It's interesting to think about Darwin working at home. His home was like his laboratory. It was his field station. He was conducting all of these little studies literally in his backyard, right? On the lawn and in the meadows and in the woodlands, making observations, but always using materials at hand. Usually, not always, but usually not really requiring any kind of sophisticated equipment. And in that respect, many of these experiments are very accessible. You don't need expensive equipment to figure out how to ask and then test a rather straightforward scientific question. All you need is sometimes a ruler and some string and paper clips and that sort of thing. And that's exactly what he did. They're also very adaptable. I found that Darwin's experiments could be scaled. They could be expanded upon. There are sometimes layers that are a bit more sophisticated, maybe for older students, college or high school. But there are versions of these experiments that are really very fun, that are suitable even for kindergartners. And they actually help get at the very fundamental question, how do you figure stuff out? How do scientists figure stuff out? Learning how to pose a question and then thinking how to creatively try to test that question is really central to the scientific process. And it is possible, I think, to teach even very young kids how to think that way through these very kind of fun, accessible, adaptable, quirky, sorts of experiments. So, what were his experiments all about? This is a lifelong passion that Darwin has, conducting his little fool's experiments. And I like to think that, number one, there is, of course, curiosity behind them. Darwin is ever curious about natural phenomena, patterns, processes, just figuring stuff out in nature. What makes things tick there in the garden and the woodlands and the meadows. But there's also a kind of underlying agenda that he has, as we'll see, that over time, he cottons onto the idea that he needs evidence, he needs data to support some of his assertions in books like On the Origin of Species. And his experiments are intended to provide just that. So evidence for a new way of understanding the world, right? And often using local case studies, little experiments that he's conducting in his lawn or in his meadows, and then sort of extrapolating from those to kind of seeing the global significance, the universal principles. So if you look at On the Origin of Species, for example, a book that Darwin had called One Long Argument, you see it riddled with the results of a number of curious experiments, all sorts of experiments. And so the book, in a sense, the book behind The Origin is this book. It is Darwin's experiment book. And this is one of his notebooks where he just recorded his experimental results, ideas about, experiments to run, ideas for questions to ask. So this book resides in Cambridge University Library, and it's just a fascinating read, absolutely fascinating, chock full of curious experiments and their results. And I'm going to give you a few examples, and then we'll talk about some examples that come from Darwin's works after The Origin of Species. One of my favorite subjects, and an interesting one that I teach actually, is biogeography. And so I was fascinated to learn about Darwin's interest in biogeography, and especially the question of dispersal. How do species become geographically dispersed? And he tried over some years all sorts of curious experiments. And sometimes they were just, you might sort of roll your eyes at them. And other times you say, well, that's really quite clever. And sometimes you think that's really very odd. For example, crawling around in the garden, collecting bird droppings to find the seeds, really interested how many seeds do birds actually disperse through their droppings. Duckweed, you see the photograph here on the left, duckweed on a duck. Duckweed is a common little plant of freshwater bodies, ponds and lakes. How do they get dispersed exactly? Well, one might assume that ducks disperse them. Darwin thought so too, but there were no data to suggest it. So what did he do? He experimented with tanks of duckweed where he's literally dunking ducks in and then quantifying, the duckweed that's adhering to the ducks. And this to him makes sense as a way for these ducks to then fly from pond to pond and thereby transport the duckweed. This is taken at Down House. Darwin's, on the one hand, he's impressed by the beauty and intricacy of some of the adaptations, or what he called contrivances for dispersal, like you see the nice plumed seed on the right here. And then at the same time, he's keeping an eye out for bird droppings, as you see on the left here, always on the lookout and ready to scrape up seeds that he might find, and then to plant them and see if they're viable, and really document truly for the first time that birds do indeed, disperse seeds in that way. But, it's one thing to think about, things getting kind of moved around on land. It's another thing to think about how species might get dispersed to very remote pieces of land, like remote oceanic islands. Think about the Galapagos archipelago, 600 or so miles off the coast of South America. So how do species end up there, right? Well, Anything that flies, that's pretty obvious, might fly there, might get blown off course by storms, but things that don't fly, they have to either raft or they have to actually survive prolonged exposure to salt water. And he got to thinking about this and thinking that it's very likely that the way plants have gotten to remote islands like the Galapagos is they simply floated. And you and I might take that for granted, right? But Darwin's friends, his contemporaries, the botanists that thought about this, thought that was just absurd. They thought there was no way that seeds could actually survive prolonged exposure to salt water. And Darwin felt, well, where are your data? Has anyone ever tested this? His friend Joseph Hooker, the botanist, the director of Kew, maybe his best friend really, threw down the gauntlet by just declaring this, an absurdity. Just couldn't really happen. So Darwin is undaunted, and this brings out the experimentizer in him. What he does is he sets up little jars at his house with seeds. He floats seeds. And Darwin does nothing by halves. This grows into dozens of jars of seeds, probably over the several years, hundreds of jars of seeds that take over the house. The whole cellar is filled with jars full of seeds floating in salt water. And the idea is to determine if these seeds are floating in salt water, can they survive that exposure? They might survive a week. Let's take a sample after a week and find out. Well, how about 2 weeks? How about a month? Maybe sample them after 2 months, 3 months. How long can they float in salt water and still germinate, still survive? So he's very excited and meticulously trying all different species and recording how long they've been exposed and their germination success rate. And it's a huge undertaking, and the kids are excited about it. And they asked Darwin, as he reports in one of his letters, they're very eager, and they asked whether he should beat Dr. Hooker. He wants to prove, his friend Hooker wrong. And Hooker, on one of his visits, sort of points out that, yeah, well, they may germinate after being exposed to salt water, but a number of those seeds actually sink. And so all bets are off, because if they sink, it's a moot point. They'll never make it to the island anyway, right? So Darwin hadn't thought of that. And so this is a little episode that, again, I think shines a little light on the human side of Darwin and his sense of humor. He's a bit taken aback, and he says, if the confounded seeds will sink, I've been taking all this trouble salting the ungrateful rascals for nothing. But he doesn't quit. He doesn't just chuck the whole thing. He goes back to the drawing board. These are some pages from the experiment book, and you see him now floating dried seeds and fruit in salt water and recording meticulously each species and how long it's exposed and its success. And this goes on page after page after page. He finally was thoroughly convinced that seeds can indeed, most species do indeed survive even prolonged exposure to salt water. Certainly long enough to be carried by oceanic currents. He used atlases that had estimated or given data on the average speed of oceanic currents to estimate how many hundreds to thousands of miles some of these seeds could have been carried in that time that they would remain viable exposed to salt water. So it's kind of a classic Darwin, chasing down this question and testing it, let's just say exhaustively, at this point. And this is a fun thing that really any of us can do. This is eminently accessible in schools, at home, to kind of ask a basic question about, could seeds survive salt water? Let's just, let's run Darwin's experiment. Why not? We can do our own version of these seed salting experiments and test how long these seeds might float, might remain viable. Let's changing gears just a little bit, but thinking again about dispersal, coming back to ponds and lakes. I mentioned the duckweed already, but he's also kind of thinking about aquatic animals like small aquatic snails. And he's wondering, well, how do snails get carried, right? I can understand how duckweed might stick to the, the back of a duck easily enough, but how might snails be carried? And so he's envisioning that snails, aquatic snails, actually might climb onto ducks, maybe adhering to their feet. When ducks are sleeping at night and their feet are dangling down in the water, that maybe the snails might be curious or just moving around. They end up on their feet. They happen to be there when the duck wakes up, and off it flies to another lake, and whoa, it carries the snails with them, perfectly reasonable. So Darwin does an experiment, and this is not one that we necessarily want to replicate very literally, but he actually uses actual duck's feet, severed duck's legs. Presumably they ate the ducks, and he dangled, as you see in the drawing here, he dangled the duck's feet in an aquarium full of snails. And the idea was to see how often the snails might actually climb on board. And once the snails are on these feet, he would remove them and set them on the mantle and see how long will those snails hang on out of the water, because that's very important. Of course, they'll hang on for dear life, and they can for 24 or 48 hours. And so to him, that really answered the question. That was plenty long enough for ducks to carry snails from pond to pond. Now, we can do a version of this experiment. We don't want to use severed duck's legs, I don't think, right? But we can actually make our own duck feet models, right? We can use little dowels and floats, and we can cut out little fabric duck feet and use a drop line, as I'm doing here with one of my kids. And you can go fishing for snails, and you can see, like Darwin, what aquatic organisms might colonize these quote unquote duck feet, and see if this is actually a possibility that's consistent with what Darwin found. It was pretty fun, actually, pretty fun experiment. Darwin is consumed by this question of dispersal. He even becomes one of the original crowdsourcers. These are little snippets of several letters that Darwin wrote to the editor of the Gardener's Chronicle, open letters to the readers of the magazine. And he's asking them to try this experiment. You guys try this too. I circled this one passage here. Will any of your readers be so kind as to inform me whether such experiments have already been tried? And secondly, what class of seeds or particular species had they have any reason to suppose would be eminently liable to be killed by saltwater? He actually had readers of this magazine try the experiment, float their own seeds, collect the data, send the data into Darwin, and some of them are actually reported, their results are reported in the Origin of Species, which is pretty neat. So I think of him as the original crowdsourcer, asking people to try this at home and send me your results. This is also a subject that brings out Darwin's sense of humor, again, the indulgent dad. So here, Darwin is explaining to his friend Hooker in a letter that he tried a very odd experiment that was suggested by his 8-year-old son, Francis Darwin. He went by Frankie at that age, Frank later. So Darwin says to Hooker, P.S., I must tell you another of my profound experiments. And, profound is like, he underlines that like it's an eye roll, He says, Frankie says to me, why shouldn't a bird, imagine a bird having eaten seeds, has seeds in the crop, flying over the open ocean, maybe, killed by a hawk or maybe lightning or apoplexy, something or other. The poor bird plunges to the ocean surface, and the corpse floats and eventually washes up on some distant shore. And voila, you have seeds that may have survived that process. And you have the built-in fertilizer of the rotting bird. And wasn't that a wonderful way to disperse seeds? And, many dads or moms might say, yeah, that's an interesting idea. Maybe. Well, Darwin actually does it. He actually does it. In the letter to Hooker, he says, no sooner said than done. A pigeon that he fed seeds to, poor pigeon, has now floated 30 days in salt water in his cellar, right, with seeds in crop, right? This poor bird, you can imagine how putrid that was. Then he plants the bird, seeds and all, and he says, they have grown splendidly, right? So this is again kind of classic Darwin to me. You know, there's another interesting experiment that gets reported in an interesting way in The Origin of Species, and this is also pretty accessible to us. And it's an interesting one because it figures in what may be the very first described, in the literature, described ecological food chain. In The Origin, Darwin says, on pages 73, 74, from experiments which I've tried, I very little doubt that if the whole genus of bumblebees became extinct or very rare, the heartsease, which is a little violet, and the red clover would become very rare or disappear. Okay, well, why is that? Well, because, you know, these flowers depend upon the bees for pollination, for fertilization. So he says the visits of the bees are highly beneficial to the fertilization of our clovers, he says. But then he points out that the number of bees depends in great degree on the number of mice in the area, right? And that the number of mice is largely dependent, as everyone knows, he says, on the number of cats. So he's imagining that the field mice are predators on the bumblebee nests. They nest under the ground, and that cats are predators of the mice. And in this way, he thinks, in an indirect kind of chain of reaction, he says in The Origin, it's quite credible that the presence of a feline animal in large numbers in a district might determine, through the intervention first of mice, then of bees, the frequency of flowers in a district. Who would have thought, right, that the frequency of flowers in a given area might ultimately be influenced by the population of cats in that area? Very interesting. And you know, this is a curious suggestion that's actually based on an experiment, not the whole chain of reaction, but actually the first step in the reaction, the dependence upon the clovers on bees in order to become pollinated. So this is a little snippet from his experiment book, where you see him recording on April 13th, common red clover, and he basically takes patches and he puts netting over some, and he thereby excluding bees, and he leaves others open to bees. And then he, after a fashion, collects the flowers and counts up the seeds that are produced by the flowers under the netting versus the ones that are open to the bees. And you see what he says here. The ones under the net produced not one single seed, 3 exclamation marks. Of this, he is quite sure, right? Very, very excited, you know, establishing that critical link. You know, really, Darwin spent an awful lot of time in his fields and meadows doing experiments and other studies. And a lot could be said about his many adventures in field botany, many of them with the assistance of the children's governess, Miss Thorley. Catherine Thorley was quite an accomplished kind of amateur botanist. Here you often see Darwin kind of commenting his little minor triumphs when he's just figured out how to identify a species. You know, I mean, who hasn't triumphed when they've keyed out a grass, right? As Darwin says here, I never expected to make out a grass in my life, right? And again, it kind of brings out that human side of Darwin. You know, he's just, you know, he's exuberant about these things that he's learning about in nature. But he also has this keen eye for setting up interesting experiments in his fields, in the lawn and in the meadows. And I'm just going to briefly mention 2 of them that are really considered to be foundational ecological experiments today: the famous lawn plot experiment and the weed garden experiment. Both of these have been replicated or reproduced at Down House. And so these are fairly recent photographs. You can see these today, these replications, and there are dedicated volunteers at Down House that actually continue to collect data from these replications of Darwin's experiments. Essentially, in the lawn plot experiment, he is keeping track of how the population within this unmown patch of grass is changing over time as the different plants kind of come in and go out. There's competition. He's ultimately using these data to formulate the principle that he articulates in The Origin that modern ecologists know as niche partitioning and competitive exclusion. You know, those ideas in ecology originate, curiously enough, with this little 3x4 foot plot in his grass, you know, amazingly enough. Similarly, his weed garden experiment, you know, a pioneering study in population ecology, is really a demographic study of seedlings as they're coming up, and their mortality rates at different age classes and such. All done literally in his backyard. Very interesting. And again, you know, we can do this too, right? You too can have a lawn plot. You too can have a weed garden, easily done at school or at home. And it's possible to emulate his experimental approach and actually see the kinds of data, collect the kinds of data that Darwin collected. So those are just a few examples of topics pertaining to the experiments that we see in The Origin. But, you know, The Origin was not Darwin's last book, and in fact, far from it. Maybe his most famous book. And remember, I said that Darwin called The Origin one long argument. And I've thought of all of the subsequent books. If you look at The Origin and all the other books together, I consider this one even longer argument, because many of these books are designed to or intended to take certain ideas or themes in The Origin of Species and follow them out, collect more data and really expand upon some of their themes. Now, out of these many books, there are about 10 of them after The Origin. No fewer than 6 are actually on botany, botanical books of various kinds. So plants became an extremely important group for Darwin to gain insight into the natural world. But you have to really kind of pull out and kind of look at the big picture to appreciate that his penchant for experimentizing and conducting these curious little at-home experiments, it is far-ranging. It's not just the botany, but extends also to zoology, to the pigeons and the barnacles, and as we'll see, worms, and studying the formation of honeycomb and pollination behavior of insects and all sorts of things. We don't have time to give you examples of all of these things, but I'm going to try to give you a real sampler here, if I can. This is an interior view of Darwin's greenhouse, where he grew orchids, he grew carnivorous plants and climbing plants, all of his kind of pet plant groups for doing these various experiments. And orchids were actually the first one he really delved into. This is the subject of his very first book after The Origin of Species, was this treatise on orchids and their pollination. And all of these black and white drawings come from his book. Notice the meticulous mapping out of the anatomy, the structure of these flowers, and he's kind of figuring out exactly how insects fit into these flowers, like a key into a lock. You know, many orchids have a very close relationship with very particular insect pollinators, and they produce pollen in little packets that are known as pollinia. You can see in the lower left here, you can see my cursor, you know, you can poke a pencil like Darwin did into just the right spot in the center of an orchid flower, and the little adhesive base of the pollinia will stick to the pencil, and you can pull them out. And in that way, you can actually pull out the pollen and then hand pollinate, which Darwin did quite a lot of. He also discovered that some orchids are great fun, because some orchids actually have a kind of ballistic pollen dispersal mechanism where they fire their pollinia. And this is I just give you a quote here from his friend and neighbor, John Lubbock, where Lubbock had commented that Mr. Darwin was good enough to irritate one of these flowers in his presence, and the pollinium was fired nearly 3 feet, where it struck and stuck to a window pane. Darwin kind of cottoned on to what fun he could have with this. So what he would do with unsuspecting family and friends is he would kind of fire the pollinia at them, and the pollinia would come and stick to them. He always thought that was hilarious. So Darwin is studying orchids also in the field, not just his greenhouse. There's a favorite spot not far from the house that the family would go to have picnics called Orchis Bank or Down Bank, where he studied the local orchid population, very interested in insects like this beautiful moth you see here, the burnet moth. Notice the curled up proboscis with all these yellow structures. Those are the pollinia, the little pollen packets of an orchid stuck to the proboscis. And this little diagram here, drawing, comes from Darwin's book with an unfurled proboscis, kind of showing how the pollinia end up stuck on those. He's fascinated by that very close relationship between insect and flower in the case of orchids. And it leads him into deeper and deeper studies in pollination. And he's interested not just in mechanisms of cross-pollination, but especially any form of pollination that involves movement of the flowers. It's what he called irritable flowers, irritability. And we see Darwin in his notebooks and elsewhere. This is a page from one of his notebooks, mapping out what he calls the gangway, the way that insects enter a flower, and mapping out the exact position of stamens and pistils. He's looking at plants like beans, for example, with their very curious contrivance of the stamens and pistil kind of wrapped up in this tubular structure, and the way in which that works almost like a kind of Rube Goldberg device, where bees land on the lower petals and extrudes the stamens and pistils that way. The beautiful mountain laurel, Kalmia, for example, has reflexed stamens that are dislodged by bees, and they flick up and they shower the bees with pollen. Barberries and mahonias have touch-sensitive stamens. Here on the left, you see the stamens kind of cocked in their cocked position. A bee touches these, then they go bing, and they shower that insect with pollen. Darwin really, any kind of plant movement, he was really fascinated by. And in the process of studying pollination in many of these plants, he discovered something interesting. It's really an independent discovery of an interesting phenomenon. The discovery wasn't his alone, but he realized that certain plants like primroses exist in two morphs. And here you see on the left, the so-called pin morph with a very long pistil. And you can't see them, but they're very short stamens within this corolla tube. On the right, you see very long stamens coming out the mouth of the corolla tube, and the pistil is very, very short. So this is an example of heterostyle. And I like to cite this as an example of Darwin, the experimentalist, who poses a hypothesis that gets shot down, right? And this is the nature of science also, because he's fascinated by this, and he thinks that the female morph, that maybe this is evolution in action, and that this female morph, as he calls it, is becoming more and more female, and eventually maybe will only produce female flowers, whereas the so-called male morph will only produce stamens eventually, only the male flowers. And so he's thinking of ways to test this hypothesis. And so he gets this idea that if the female morph is becoming more and more female, maybe they're producing most of the seeds, and the male morph produces less and less seeds over time. So, he devises experiments that involve very careful hand pollination of loads of primroses, transferring pollen from one morph to another morph and within morphs. He also has to enlist the help of the kids, because he wants to really quantify how common are the morphs in nature. So his field hands are his kids, Horace, Lenny, Frankie, Bessie. This is a page from his notebook where he says, "My children gathered great bunch of cowslips. 79 stalks were male flowers, 52 were female flowers." This is pretty typical. The kids are always excited to kind of, come to his assistance. And he's doing these experiments meticulously, page after page after page in the experiment, the results of these hand crosses, and then quantifying the seed production produced by the different crosses. And this is this is one of those cases, though, where Darwin's cherished hypothesis turned out not to hold up. We can think of him as having encountered his friend Huxley's great tragedy of science, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact, right? He hypothesized that the so-called male morphs would produce fewer seeds. It was just the opposite. The male morphs in his study happened to produce many, rather more seeds. So he went back to the drawing board. He eventually concluded correctly in the modern view that this is more an adaptation to enforce outcrossing. It's not an example of male and female flowers, dioecious evolving in the species necessarily. So, I like to think that we too can follow in his footsteps, and we can do all kinds of floral observations in that spirit, looking at these curious contrivances that he was fascinated by. Primroses are very common florist plants. Purple loosestrife, salvias are common garden plants. All sorts of interesting adaptations like lever action movement of stamens, for example. Different morphs, movement like barberry and mahonia. All of these are accessible to us too. And then, of course, there was this whole episode, Darwin working with carnivorous plants. Speaking of plant movement, Darwin is very interested in plant movement partly because he thinks evolutionarily there's a fundamental connection between animals and plants. So any kind of plant that has an animal-like feature, he's interested in. Similarly, any plants that he thinks might be, or any animals rather, that might be sort of plant-like, he's interested in, certain marine invertebrates, for example. So he becomes smitten by sundews. And as his wife observed to a friend, he hopes in the end to prove it to be an animal. And she's only half kidding. He really sees these little sundews as like little would-be animals of the botanical world. And in classic Darwinian fashion, he is sort of wondering, where do you begin? He's interested in the way that they catch insects and other things, and are they actually consuming them? Do they digest these things? And so in classic fashion, he first experiments with stuff he has at hand. For example, a bundle of his own hair, the size of a fly, he applies to the sundew. He cuts off a bit of his toenail and feeds it to a sundew. He wants to see what happens. And what he concludes is that sundews do not like toenails and they do not like hair. They sort of perform the equivalent of a kind of spitting out of these things. They will not hang on to them and digest them. But when you feed them insects, something nitrogenous, right? Something with some protein and nitrogen, then they begin to perk up. So, these are also experiments that are eminently accessible to us because sundews are readily available in many nurseries. So are fly traps, for that matter. Darwin did extensive experiments with fly traps. And, trying to get a sense of the questions he was asking, marveling at the way that they move, it's all very easy for us to do. Similarly with climbing plants, Darwin, this is another group of plants that has an animal-like aspect to it. Climbing plants that almost seem to sense their surroundings. They're touch sensitive. They grab onto supports and they grow up those supports. This is from an advertisement, but this is a kind of plant case that the Darwin family had in their drawing room. And at one point, Darwin kind of took over the family plant case for his experiments with climbing plants. And this is a reproduction from Mia Allen's wonderful book from 1977, showing how he would set up a plant, a potted plant inside the case, and then affix with a little bit of wax, a little needle so that he could make the tip of the tendril visible. And then he had a card with a black spot as a kind of reference marker. And then you see the top of the diagram. This glass represents the top of the case. And he's looking through the glass and simply putting tracing paper on the top and then tracing the movement of the tendril or the growing shoot. And in that way, Darwin sort of discovered this phenomenon of circumnutation, a term that he coined, in fact. in his book on climbing plants. This really lends itself to at-home and at-school experiments as well. There are many plants that are readily available. Brewer's hops, I know that's especially popular in my neck of the woods and in Washington State. This is a great one to do circumnutation experiments with. A young growing shoot, you can use a cutout kind of paper plate fixed with numbers like a clock, affix this to the top of the pot, observed from above. You actually can see how the growing tip of the shoot is keeping time and how rapidly it is rotating in circles, which is just what Darwin did. So he goes into this series of experiments with the help of his son, Frank, on plant movement, climbing, phototropism, movement toward or away from light. Darwin and his son found that canary grass, when you cut off the tips of the seedlings, they no longer will respond to light. Now, this is a common kind of classroom experiment now, right? You have these little growing seedlings and expose them to a light source from one direction. And it won't take long before the seedlings are kind of bending towards that light source. They're positively phototropic. But when they cut off those tips, they no longer respond. And so they got to thinking, well, what's going on? You know, maybe because they're injured, you know, cutting off the tips of the growing shoot would certainly injure the plant. So they have to devise an experiment that doesn't involve injuring these little seedlings. And so they come up with an ingenious experiment. And I think of it as, you know, kind of using shades, right? They're taking one group and they're fitting them out with shades, sort of designer shades of a different sort, like little glass caps, or sometimes little tin foil caps, where you just kind of make a little cap and just like a sheath and put it over the tip of the growing shoot, right? And then do the same with glass so that light can still get through. And indeed, you know, the little seedlings with the opaque shades failed to curve towards the light, whereas the ones that you think of these as controls, right? With little glass caps where light can get through, they did respond to the light. So they're able to demonstrate that there's something about the cells at the tip, the growing tip of the seedling, is they're perceiving light, right? They can see in a sense. But how do they do that? What kind of sort of physiological signaling is going on? You know, that's way beyond them. They can't go beyond these experiments, but they really are anticipating the discovery of plant growth hormones. They anticipate the discovery of reactions like phototropisms and gravitropism. They did experiments like you see here. This is from Darwin's book with little radicals of beans, excising the tip and showing how they no longer respond to gravity, for example, really kind of pioneering these plant physiology experiments. And finally, I'm just going to begin to wind down here with one last example, because I did mention that not all of Darwin's interests were botanical. Some of them were zoological. And interestingly, his interest in worms and his experiments with worms sort of bookends his life of experimentizing, right, as he liked to call it. Back in the 1830s, he actually was setting up experiments in fields, putting cinders and rocks out, getting a sense of earthworms as a geological force, as they're moving through the soil and they're casting worm castings. They're helping turn over the soil, and objects on the surface are slowly sinking. So he sees them as a geological force. He starts those experiments in the 1830s. Much later, he returns to those questions, and then he develops an appreciation for the worms as individual animals, as animals with intelligence, with personality. He begins to keep them almost as pets. As he wrote in a letter to one of his nieces, he says, "I'm becoming deeply attached to worms." He and his nieces, Sophie and Lucy, others, they helped him with various experiments. His son Horace actually helped with an interesting experiment. Horace, when he grew up, became an inventor, and he was a co-founder of the Cambridge Scientific company, scientific instrument manufacturing company. Quite an inventive guy. He actually devised a way that Darwin could quantify the rate of subsidence of, let's say, a stone, like a millstone, on the surface by the action of worms underneath the surface. And here you can see this so-called wormstone at Down House today. It is a millstone. And when it was operational, you can see the apparatus in the upper right here. This is a drawing that Horace Darwin published in 1901. This is essentially a precision micrometer, something that you could fit to the top of the millstone and measure its subsidence over time. In addition to this experiment, Darwin and his nieces set up big plots where they were collecting worm castings and drying them and weighing them and quantifying just how much soil are they moving up to the surface each year. In one study, up to 16 tons per acre are moved annually by the worms, they estimated. So again, this is resonating with his idea that worms are a slow and steady geological force, really another form of uniformitarian geological change. But in his interest with worms' personality and their sensory abilities, I'll tell you about one last quirky experiment, and that's one that he conducted with his grandson, Bernard, his son, Frank, his wife, Emma, who was an accomplished pianist. This is an experiment, you can kind of see it sort of set up in Down House today. This is an interior view of the house in the drawing room, and you can see in the back of the room, the piano, and you see this, this bassoon, and you see a pot, a flower pot. And you might assume that, that perhaps flowers, potted flowers would be in this pot, but you would be wrong. Worms would be in that pot, right? This is one of Darwin's wormeries. And the idea was to have the flower pot sit on the piano or sit on a nearby table while Bernard is playing the penny whistle and Emma is playing the piano, and Francis is on the bassoon, and they're serenading these worms. They want to see if the worms can react to music. And of course, they don't seem to have a musical appreciation, but they do certainly respond to vibration. So that when the flower pot is on the piano, they get very excited and they come up to the surface. But Emma, his wife, and characteristically, you know, she has a very dry sense of humor as well. She comments in a letter to one of their kids, "Father is taken to training earthworms, but he doesn't make much progress, as they can neither see nor hear." I love that. You know, so, you know, but we too can make wormeries very easily. You know, this is one of mine, where you can do some of Darwin's experiments. For example, putting your worms in a wormery and giving them paper cutouts of different shapes. You can test what they prefer. Darwin actually did this experiment. You can actually serenade them with music if you like. You can see what their reaction will be if you apply vibration or not. Much fun with worms. So just to conclude here, I wanted to sort of underscore the point that, you know, there are a lot of interesting and quirky experiments that Darwin conducted, but they're all of a piece. They're all to ultimately gain insight into the workings of the natural world. And I find it really fascinating that he lived in a time and place, and given his creativity, that he was able to learn at home, right? In his own study, in his greenhouse, in his fields, in his lawn, his garden. He was able to learn some interesting things, really gain insights into the natural world that had truly global implications, that could extrapolate up and give you ultimate insights into ecology, into evolution, into the workings of ecosystems. So I like to think of him working away on all of these books. In a way, I picture him as revolutionary as the earthworms. The earthworms are slowly but surely remaking the landscape. And Darwin is conducting these experiments over 40 plus years. Slowly but surely, he's addressing in subject after subject, in book after book, He is really turning over received wisdom. I think of those books as sort of an analogy as like his worm castings, slowly kind of making the world anew. I think that's one very valuable lesson we can glean from Darwin's wonderful experiments. And the other is just the fun of it and the educational potential of it. We can be experimentizers too. We too can conduct any number of these experiments in our own homes, in our yards, at school. They're eminently accessible. And with that, I want to thank you all again for being here, for this invitation. Again, it's been a real pleasure. I'll be happy to answer any questions. And of course, I want to wish you all a very happy Darwin Day.
Well, thank you very much. And encourage everyone in the quiet of your own living room or wherever you're watching to give a hearty round of applause for Dr. Costa for that fantastic talk. And as an experimentizer myself, I found that very inspiring. And we're going to open things up for questions now. So there's the Q&A feature.
Q&A, yes.
So if you have questions for Dr. Costa, you can type them in to the
Here's a question.
Q&A, and it looks like we already have a question.
Yeah, let's see. The question is, given how slow mail was in the 19th century, how do you think it affected Darwin's craving for new information that he had to rely on letters and newspapers, as well as hard to obtain print works? Yeah, I think it was just a fact of life, how slow things were compared to what we're used to today, with PDF attachments, by email. And I think that their pace of life was just, scaled accordingly. It was just a given when he writes to his friend Asa Gray in Boston or Cambridge in the US. It's going to take several months and to get there, and then it's going to take another couple of months to get a reply. And I think it's just sort of a given. Here's a question. The question is, because I'm not sure the audience can see the question, so I think I should read them. Is that right? Yes. You mentioned toenails on sundews. Might they or any inanimate object be eaten, quote unquote, if they were caused to wiggle or move? So that's a very good question and something that Darwin explored. And actually, so the short answer is ultimately no, right? In some cases, they can be induced to react, to respond initially, but they're not fooled for long. It's really a kind of chemosensory process, and they're looking for those nitrogenous substances. And so they might initially respond to an inanimate object, even if you wiggle it a bit, poke at it, but not for long. It'll kind of cotton on to that, and will really only respond fully and begin to secrete digestive enzymes when it's something that that they can actually digest. And if you think about it, that's actually pretty adaptive, because you think about these sundews out there in nature, debris must blow on them all the time, right? Just, in storms and things, just bits of debris end up falling on them. If they responded to every little thing touching on them, they would actually waste an awful lot of energy, trying to needlessly digest things that are indigestible. A good question. Question here about Darwin and Wallace. Could you compare and contrast landed Darwin's method with less wealthy Wallace and Huxley for how they approached their research in the field and regarding lecturing, including the need to earn money? Yeah, that's an interesting point there. I mean, it's certainly true. I mean, Darwin was very privileged. He was, even by modern standards, very wealthy individual in his time, and certainly by our standards today. And his friends Wallace and Huxley were more impecunious, and Huxley certainly needed to lecture and work for a living. He's one of the first of the real professional biologist in a sense. I mean, Darwin is sometimes viewed as the last of the great, what has been called country house naturalists, you know, wealthy individuals with the resources and the time on their hands and the servants, et cetera, to do their science right there at home. And institutions of research that we know today, research universities, labs, you know, museums, that was kind of in its infancy, and the idea of a professional biologist, the likes of a Huxley, was kind of a novelty. Wallace is sort of in a class all of his own, really, truly an individual of enormous talents, picking himself up by his own bootstraps, you know, making his way in the world by his writings, his collections, his lecturing. You know, by the time the end of Wallace's long life, he's certainly one of the most famous naturalists in the world. But he, unlike Darwin, was not an experimentalist. You know, he was more the observer and collector and synthesizer of information. He did recommend experiments. He had ideas about experiments. Wallace did in aposematism, for example, the question of whether brightly colored caterpillars will be avoided by birds as opposed to green, you know, kind of cryptically colored caterpillars. But he was not so much interested in conducting these experiments himself. Yeah, thanks for that.
I had a question. It sounds like you have repeated many of Darwin's experiments yourself. And I was wondering, of Darwin's experiments that you've repeated yourself, which was the most fun to do, and which one seemed to produce the clearest result or the clearest data?
Yeah. Well, I think hands down, probably my favorite is duck feet. And I've done this with teachers. I've done it with my own kids. It really is fun if you have access to a little pond or, you know, lake or something. Because, you know, making the models is kind of fun, and it takes a little trial and error to get the ratios right. You know, you need a little weight on the bottom, and I give instructions, you know, in my book. But you want to make a little model duck foot with a drop line or something, so you can cast that, you know, throw that duck foot out in the pond, and then you have to be patient. But you can wait a week, maybe you can wait 2 if you have the luxury of waiting longer, and then kind of reel it in, and that really is satisfying. It is truly amazing. You can experiment with different textures of material. There's different kinds of fabric and other substrates, and different aquatic organisms are more likely to adhere to some rather than others. But we've certainly pulled in aquatic snails and rotifers and algae, you know, nice little algae protists of various kinds. That's very, very satisfying, actually, pretty fun. The worms can be a tricky nut to crack, you know, the earthworms. You have to be patient with your wormery. And so that one takes a little practice, but it can be great fun once you get them to kind of you know, cooperate with you.
Need to build myself some duck feet to look for nematodes on them.
Definitely, yes, absolutely. Other questions, anyone? Let's see. Oh, I see a question. It was not in the Q&A, but it was in the chat. Oh no, it's in the Q&A. Let's see here. Given what has been learned in the time since the 1880s when Darwin died, or 1913 for Wallace, what do you think would have amazed them most about what we know today of genetics, developmental biology, paleontology, geology, etc., and their contribution to present knowledge? Wow. Yeah, I mean, gosh, you know, it's huge. You know, it's really a hard one to answer. You get a sense from these experiments how far-ranging Darwin's curiosity was, and Wallace too was quite a broad and synthetic thinker. They'd be just absolutely fascinated by all of these areas. I mean, just think about it. You know, the paleontological insights, just the nature of genetics, the nature of heredity, actually better understanding that process. Continental drift, plate tectonics would blow them away. That was not at all on anyone's horizon at that time. The amazing idea that the Earth's surface is actually so dynamic. I'd be hard pressed to pick any one area that they would be most impressed with.